So I'd like to welcome you all to this Momentum Policy Primary on proportional representation. At least I hope that's what you've all turned up for, because that's what it is, Momentum Policy Primary on proportional representation. And I'd like to start actually by saying thanks to Momentum for making possible this whole process of policy primaries, which I think is really interesting and, and which we all appreciate a lot. Now, I'm imagining that most of the people who've come along tonight are in favour of proportional representation, but if you've just come along because you're curious, or if you'd like to learn more, if you have some questions, then you also are very welcome, and we would love to hear from you. There will be plenty of time to kind of ask questions and discuss things. So before we get going with the speakers, I'm first of all just going to give you a little bit of background on the organisations that are bringing you this event tonight. So I'm on the executive committee of the Labour Campaign for Electoral Reform, and LCER is a membership organisation that works inside the Labour Party to promote proportional representation. And then Labour for New Democracy is a campaigning project that brings together lots of organisations from across the Labour movement to campaign for one thing: a vote on PR at the next Labour Party conference. Now, both of these organisations are squarely focused on working within the Labour Party, and there's a really good reason for that. We are never ever going to get a decent electoral system unless Labour makes it happen. First past the post is so completely stacked in the Tories' favour that there's no chance at all that the Tories will change the voting system. And all of the other parties are too small to bring this change about. So on the issue of a fair and proportional voting system, it's absolutely clear that we have to fight this fight within the Labour Party. It's our fight. Now, in terms of the Labour Party, there is some very good news. A year ago, the opinion polls showed that just over 3/4 of Labour Party members were in favour of PR. There are some new polls, which I think Caroline's going to talk about later, which show that this percentage has grown. Many constituency Labour parties have passed resolutions on proportional representation. We've got growing numbers of MPs joining our ranks, and I think in the first round of the Momentum consultation, more groups submitted resolutions on PR than on any other topic. So, this really is a thing that's happening. But in order to make it happen, we don't just need people to be sort of vaguely in favour of PR and think it's a good thing. We actually need resolutions on the agenda of the upcoming Labour Party conference. And so I think it's really important to be honest about what we want from this whole process. We don't just want people to say, okay, we're in favour of PR. We are trying to persuade you in the final ballot of the Momentum Policy Primary to vote for the motion on PR actually as your top choice. So tonight, I am bringing you a pretty star-studded lineup, but they're not all going to be in the same room at the same time all together. It's going to be kind of in order. I'm going to ask all our guests to be relatively brief, no more than 10 minutes each, because I do want there to be lots of time for questions and discussion. Now, we were going to have Howard Beckett first. Is he here? He's here. Good. Okay, so Howard Beckett probably needs no introduction from me at all, but I'll introduce him anyway. He is the Assistant General Secretary of Unite the Union. He's Unite's representative on Labour's National Executive Committee. And as you probably all know, he is one of the candidates for the General Secretary of Unite. So without further ado, Howard, it's over to you. And,
Thank you, Maria.
If you could take about 10 minutes,
Although brevity is no problem. I've just come from another meeting on COVID, and trying to switch my head into the thought processes in respect of electoral systems is never easy. And thank you for the introduction. I'm going grey because of the Labour Party NEC. It's not a good experience at all at the moment. So my apologies if I look overly haggard these days. It's the stress that has been caused by the frustrations of the nonsense that you hear on there. So thank you very much for the invitation is the first thing to say. And I should say that I'm talking in a personal capacity tonight. I'm an advocate for proportional representation for the reasons that I'll try and explain to everyone. But my union at the moment has a policy of supporting first past the post. My union is Unite, and it has a policy of supporting first past the post. That's a policy that I hope over the course of time will change with as the debate moves towards proportional representation. And I very much feel that I need to be part of that debate. We did have a discussion amongst our constitutional committees within Unite in 2017. And at that time, I was playing a regional role for Unite. I was the regional secretary in the West Midlands, and very much felt that my voice on a national level wasn't heard enough within those constitutional committees. I became a little bit frustrated, I suppose, in that regard. The West Midlands Regional Committee was the only constitutional committee that passed a motion in favour of proportional representation. Everyone else remained in favour of the status quo. And I'll come back to that issue of the status quo, Maria, as I give my narrative as to why I think the proportional representation is one of the transitional policies that Labour should adopt. And I say one of because I think it's very important that none of us present any electoral system as being a panacea for a solution to the ills of society. But it is part of the picture, in my view, as to how we do tackle the ills of society. So I won't make any presumption that everyone is in favour of proportional representation, and I will make my case for it, and then also make my case as to how I think it can be achieved as policy for the Labour Party. So the first place that I would like to start, Maria, in regard to PR, is talking about the democratic deficit of first past the post, and that democratic deficit is weighed against Labour. The harsh reality for all of us is that if Labour and the Tories end equal as a percentage on votes, the Tories will have 12 more seats than Labour. For Labour to win a majority in Parliament, they need to have a lead in the polls of 7.4%, compared to the Tories, who need a lead of 3.4%. The boundary changes, if they came in, would make that worse. It would mean that Labour would need a lead of 8.2% in the polls in order to be successful. If you're a supporter of the Green Party right now, then 1.2 million votes gets you one seat in Parliament, whereas 29,000 votes gets the DUP a seat in Parliament. And the reality is that democratic deficit we have to accept as Democrats, in my view, is wrong. And those who argue that proportional representation opens the door for minority extremist views, in my view, are wrong. I simply would make the argument always that democracy is right and that you must win the argument within those democratic parameters. And I talk as a person coming from a legal background who believes in the rights of prisoners to vote. I believe that a society needs to reflect the makeup of a society, and it's then your responsibility to get out into the communities and make your argument. And that voice is ignored element of this debate is, for me, absolutely vital. We've seen what's happened to society as a consequence of first past the post. And that is that people have not needed to talk to communities about the issues of those communities. That's probably best referenced in Scotland, where we could have an argument in Scotland until the cows come home about whether or not the SNP is a party of socialism or whether or not it's solely a party of nationalism. The reality, in my view, is that it does not matter. The SNP realised very quickly that Labour was no longer talking for its communities, and as a consequence, organised within those communities, organised in a way that spoke for the issues of those communities and took the clothing of Labour. And the reason why they could do that was because Labour had become complacent in respect of how it needed to respond to those constituencies that had always voted Labour. They had stopped listening to those communities because, frankly, they felt that they could put up a wooden spoon with a red rosette and that wooden spoon would be elected into Westminster as a consequence of having the Labour brand. And that cannot be right for us as a movement. It cannot be right for us as a movement that people no longer have to make the argument within those communities from where they come from. It is, in my view, the reason as to why Labour has got used to flying in candidates to constituencies where those candidates have no relevance to the constituency, because they expect that the vote will go for Labour in any event. It is, in my view, the reason as to why we have seen Brexit. Whether or not you're pro-Brexit or whether or not you're against Brexit, and there are many of us who feel that the argument for a socialist Brexit was never heard. Whether or not you're pro or against Brexit, the reality is that people had a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity of their vote actually mattering, and they wanted to send a message to the establishment. And those who argue that PR is a neoliberal type of agenda, it's an identity politics, it moves us away from class issues, are, in my view, wrong. Any electoral system that you have must be a system where you have to win the arguments within your communities, you have to understand those community issues, and you have to offer alternatives to those communities. And proportional representation, because it is more democratic, is precisely that. It is not moving to identity politics. It is a voting system that means that you must listen to the issues of your communities, and therefore you must listen to your class issues. And proportional representation, in my view, would cure the ills of the Labour Party. In my view, the Labour Party's movement in Scotland, what happened in Scotland, is the warning light for all of us as to what could happen in the rest of the UK. What's happened in the red wall seats is once again the warning light for Labour as to what could happen to Labour's existence. Where Labour is going to right now, in a direction where it is no longer speaking for workers, no longer speaking for working class communities, is reflective of the fact that years and years and years of first past the post has meant that we now have a parliamentary Labour Party that no longer speaks for our communities, no longer understands the issues of working class people, no longer understands the issues of trade unionism. And for me, proportional representation is part of the solution of making sure that the Labour Party looks back to its core roots, looks back to the trade union movement, and starts to once again reflect the real issues of working class people. I also, as a trade unionist, have a very selfish reason for wanting something different than the status quo in respect of a voting system. And that is because the status quo voting system, first past the post, has offered nothing for trade unionists. We have seen decades now of workers' rights being undermined because it does not matter whether or not you get a Labour government. The Labour government will be hampered by the voting system, and anything that they put in will be reversed out as soon as there is a Conservative government. So it's the reason why we saw the Thatcher laws on the first past the post. It's the reason why the Blair governments failed to overturn them. It is the reason for the Trade Union Act of 2016. And it is the reason why we have moved from the 1970s, where 80% were covered by collective agreements, to now, whenever we have under 25% of the population who are covered by collective agreements. And nobody should underestimate the importance of trade unions within society right now. We have seen it at the height of COVID. We have seen that trade unions are the only voice for working class people. As much as the Labour leadership has failed, the trade unions have shown a relevance to working class people. And a voting system should do as much as possible to promote the collective voice of workers, the collective strength of workers, because it is only ultimately going to be the collective strength of workers that mean that there will be proper and transformative change within society. But I referenced previously that this is not a panacea of a solution for the ills of society, and it is not. But it is certainly part of the solution. If we think of a voting system as having to be democratic and we move it to that democratic place, and then what are we left with? We are left with people who have to win the arguments. That means that we tackle those arguments of the right wing, and let nobody tell us that first past the post has produced some centric government, whereas proportional representation opens the door for extremists. Right here now in 2021, we have a government that within any other country in the European countries would be described as a party of nationalist interests only. If this party, if this government existed in France, there would be no place for Marine Le Pen. This government that we have in the UK is as extreme and as a right wing as we could possibly expect. And don't let anybody tell you that the experience of Germany or the experience of Israel means that proportional representation is a failure. It is not. Those are countries where their own identity reflects what they get in government. It is not the voting system that decides what they get in government, but their own identity. And our identity as nations is something that is very different. Our identity as nations in the 1970s was an identity that reflected the importance of trade unions, reflected the importance of the collective. Our identity in 1946 was one that looked to build the social state, build the NHS, and demand that working class children get third-tier education. That has been the identity of our nations. And it has been a determination of the establishment to destroy that identity. It has been a determination of the establishment to move us to neoliberal, move us to individualization. And the voting system has allowed them to do so, because the voting system has undermined the labour voice. It has undermined working class people. It's undermined trade unionism. And it has meant that the Labour Party has started and is continuing now to mirror the party of establishment, which is the Tory party. Now, how do we achieve proportional representation? And I'll finish with this, Maria, because I know you've got other contributors. But we must win the argument within the Labour Party. The Labour Party has already moved to proportional representation for its leadership. For reasons of gerrymandering, they moved to proportional representation for the NEC elections as far as the CLPD was concerned. If we have major left unions in this country who are on the floor of conference, who support proportional representation, and my union, Unite, will have a policy conference in either September or October, where proportional representation will be on the agenda and be a motion that will be debated. And if my union, Unite, was supportive of proportional representation and other left unions, and we had left membership on the floor of conference supportive of proportional representation, we would achieve it. And if we were talking to a leadership right now that was listening to us instead of listening to the likes of Peter Mandelson, that leadership would be thinking that this is an opportunity to present something that is transformative, that can engage young people and can unite the party across all strands of the party, left, right, or centre, with something that speaks for a difference in society. And if I was the leader right now of the Labour Party, I would be talking about proportional representation, not as a panacea, but part of electoral reform that is absolutely essential. I would be looking to hereditary peers in the House of Lords and saying, look at that, 170,000 acres owned by 88 hereditary peers, all of whom are white males. That has to finish. I'd be saying to people that the House of Lords must be abolished and it must be replaced with an elected chamber. I would be saying to people that young people must have the vote at the age of 16, at the same time as saying that proportional representation must be the method of electing a government. But I would also be saying, and I talk here as somebody who came from a divided society, I would also be using the argument for proportional representation at the same time as using the argument for change to education within our nations. And I would be saying that private education within our nations needs to finish, because it creates division and it creates that hierarchical society that we are trying to finish as part of electoral reform. Those are transformative agendas. And I'll finish simply by saying this whenever people ask me, why am I talking about education at the same time as talking about an electoral voting system? I am saying it because the relevance is democracy. The relevance is removing hierarchical structures from society as so as you must speak for people. Whenever I first came to England in 1987, I came from a society ravaged by sectarian division. I found the division in England between those who had private education and those who had state education to be far more apparent than the sectarian divisions from the society that I came from. We must heal this now, and we must take forward the debate on behalf of democracy as so as we once again have to talk for our communities, and we must do it within the parameters of saying that the elitism of society must be finished, and amending the voting system is part of finishing that elitism. Thank you, Maria.
Well, thank you so much, Howard, for that. And, you know, if we were all here in person, we'd all be standing cheering in the aisles. You know, that was absolutely amazing and actually, you know, really inspiring. So, thank you so much. Um, I think it would be nice to take some questions now. We actually have three speakers tonight. John McDonnell is not here yet, but I'm sure he is coming. But let's take some questions. Now, I can't see everybody. So if you're able, please can you use the sort of little participant window and raise your little blue hand in that. Alternatively, or as well, you can just type into the chat and I or somebody will see your question. So let's keep the contributions brief. Let's not have sort of massive speeches from people, but you know, comments, questions, love to hear them. Who's going first? Well, I can't see anybody. You know what?
Pablo's got his hand up, Maria. And maybe I was too brief.
No, no, you weren't too brief. You were just right. You were exactly right. Pablo, go ahead.
Hiya. Thank you for that speech, Howard. I thought that was really good. As someone who's so sort of in Unite, what do you think the chances are of Unite supporting PR at the policy conference? And what do you think the chances are getting some of the other big unions on board, like the GMB and Unison?
Well, Pablo, it's a great question. Maria, do you okay if I just take that and answer it head on? Well, Pablo, as I referenced in my contribution, I did feel in 2017 that we'd had a general secretary election in 2016, as you'll know, being a Unite member, and it was a bitter general secretary election, and the regional secretary of the West Midlands left, and I was asked to go into the West Midlands, really to try and heal the region. And it was a tremendous experience, and we had a couple of brilliant disputes with Birmingham Bins at the time against the Labour Council. My word, history seems to repeat itself as far as Labour hierarchy is concerned. But it was a brilliant time. But it did mean that my voice in respect of our review of the voting system wasn't heard nationally. I wasn't able to go around regions or nations and make the argument, and it is the reason why this time around with our policy conference being not far away, that I'm determined to make the argument for proportional representation. I don't think that the unions can afford any longer to go on with status quo. What are the chances of it happening? Well, I think Caroline has been doing some tremendous work at getting our branches to put in motions, and I know she's very active with it. I would put the chances at around about 50-50. The last time people were persuaded to take it off the table. This time they won't take it off the table. There is going to be a Unite General Secretary election, and as Maria referenced, I'm putting my name in the hat for that. And obviously, it's likely that the new GS would be in place before the conference. So, if I was successful, I would certainly hope to have an influence on it. So I think there is a chance, and I think there is a chance now that the left unions will come on board in respect of the need for electoral change. I think the reality for all of us is that we do look at status quo as having failed. I do also, Pablo, see another way for this to happen, and that is, and I referenced this in the contribution, that is if Keir Starmer was trying to be strategic right now, thinking about the fact that he needs alliances if he's ever going to be Prime Minister, and the obvious alliances with the Liberal Democrats, thinking about the fact that he needs policies that speak to all parts of the party, talking of something that is transformative without him having to go on to an agenda that he's clearly uncomfortable with whenever it comes to talking about radical economic change and wealth taxes and the things that I would like to hear him talk about, that this is a policy that has the potential to unite the party. And if Keir Starmer talked of it, I think that the trade unions would very quickly come on board, because the trade unions ultimately do not want the internal division that the leadership has caused within Labour.
Okay, thanks very much, Howard. Now, there have actually been a couple of other questions in the chat, but I would like to move on and take the contribution from Caroline, because she's actually going to talk. Caroline has been very much involved with the work of the trade union group of the Labour Campaign for Electoral Reform. And then we'll come back to questions after that. There is just one question that was posted into the chat that I'm going to just answer now, which is somebody asked, how can we get another national vote on PR? And I think that's an interesting question. So actually, we've never had a national vote on PR. The referendum of 2011 was actually a referendum, you know, on this awful voting system, sort of the alternative vote, which was, you know, cobbled together as the price of the sort of Tory Lib Dem coalition. And it was really not a voting system that was at all proportional or indeed that was worth voting for. It's my view that most people who are active in the campaign for PR are not really talking about another referendum. I think, you know, there's no appetite for referendums in the UK. And actually what we're campaigning for is to get this into the Labour Party's next election manifesto. We can talk about that later, but I just thought I would flag that up now. Anyway, let me introduce our next speaker, who is Caroline Osborne, who is who's part of Labour for a New Democracy, and she's also the co-convener of the Labour Campaign for Electoral Reform's working group on trade unions. So Caroline, over to you.
Thanks, Maria, and thanks, Howard. Great to hear you speak. You mentioned a little bit about the trade union work we've been doing. I just want to give a little nod to Billy Hayes, who's on the call, because he's also in the trade union group. So feel free to hop in if you've got anything you want to add to the conversation, Billy. But thank you for joining us. It's good to have you here. I'll just elaborate a little bit on the trade union project. We've got 4 motions that are going to Unite Conference, whenever that will be. We've got a couple going to GMB, we've got a couple going to Unison, and we've got one going to ASLEF. So it's going to be on the conference floor or on the Zoom floor, depending on, you know, how the unions are having their conference. It's already been decided that a few of them are definitely going to be online. So watch this space and see what happens. And I'm quietly quite pleased with Howard's odds of 50-50. Well, let's hope we land in the right 50%, eh? But yeah, so it's, you know, it's definitely a changing conversation. When we started on the trade union project, it was, you know, so it was kind of difficult to get into branches, and, you know, it wasn't on people's priority list. And that is, we're seeing a change in that more people want to talk about it, which is great. You know, there's definitely some shift. With regards to CLPs, whilst we've actually been on this call, we've had notification that another CLP has passed a motion, so that takes us up to 204. We shouldn't get too many more now before the local elections in Purda, but we're looking in really good shape, which is great. And the important thing to stress, I mean, Howard sort of touched on this about forgotten communities and, you know, candidates that are parachuted in, and that kind of, the whole, you know, kind of resentment comes actually out of our voting system, where we forget huge communities. What I really would like to stress about our 204 motions that have been carried, they've been carried right across the country, you know, and they are in every region. And I mean, Scotland's a little slower catching up to the other regions, but actually they are in every region, and we've got regional groups that are working in every region as well. And, you know, we're seeing a change in conversation. It's ever so positive. I mean, what we would say with regards to anybody here is, you know, this isn't going to happen without the support of boots on the ground. So if this is something you care about, then, you know, please push your CLP to put forward a conference motion on PR, you know, and obviously make PR your first choice in the Momentum Policy primary. That's really important. Just a couple of other points that I'd like to sort of pick out from, you know, what Howard was saying and kind of elaborate on. I mean, there was a lot of talk about trade unions and, you know, and how trade unions first past the post doesn't work for trade unions. I entirely agree. And actually, when you look at trade unions in countries that use proportional representation, they have much stronger bargaining powers in countries that use PR. The way that our unions have been, you know, kind of strangled in the UK, it's because we have this situation where our voting system enables successive right-wing governments to put in successive right-wing policy. And we end up in this situation where we are now. I mean, we quite often hear the argument that, you know, well, how are we going to get socialism, you know, without, you know, a strong, how are we going to get this strong socialist government unless we win outright, you know? And that kind of argument, we hear that when we go out to trade union, to CLP meetings. And actually, you know, we have a situation where we're talking about Labour policy as being radical. And we're talking about things like nationalising railways and nationalising utilities. And we view that as radical policy in this country. Well, we don't in this room, but, you know, a lot of the media will view that as radical policy, and it's branded as being so. And I would say, look to the policy in countries that use PR, because things like, you know, sort of higher levels of spending on social, like on social welfare and higher public spending, that's just kind of pretty normal in countries that use PR. So we have this situation where, like, in 19 out of 20 of the last general elections, the majority of people have voted to the left of the Conservative Party. 19 out of 20, yet we have had a Conservative majority government for 2/3 of this time, and it's swaying policy. And it's just nudging policy further and further to the right, to where we end up in a situation where, you know, Priti Patel is quite happy with, you know, having migrants drowning in the sea or refugees drowning in the sea. You know, and we have this situation where actually, you know, there's been a bit of talk about, you know, the far right gaining representation. Well, they're there already, and they have that representation, and they have it under a party which is, you know, gaining votes, because, you know, there will be people that will always vote for them. And, you know, our electoral system allows that. Billy, you've got your hand up. Did you want to chip in as well? Billy, you're on.
Yeah, yeah. I thought I'd come in after you, Caroline, but sorry I'm a bit disembodied because I'm on the phone, so it's a bit of a funny angle. The thing that struck me about tonight, a couple of points on Howard, which was an excellent presentation. Hope he's still here listening. It was an excellent presentation, Howard. And the thing that struck me, and making me a bit historic because of what you said, because it was an Irish woman, was the first woman in Parliament, obviously Countess Markievicz. It was an Irish man who was a big wheel in the Chartist movement back in the 1830s. And I think tonight we've had an Irish man, Irish person, tell us where we need to go on this issue. And what, you know, your efforts inside Unite are really, really important. And I've just struck as somebody who was a lay activist and then a full-time officer and then a general secretary. One of the most overused words in the trade union movement is strategic. If you go to any meeting about talking about trade unions, somebody always says at some point, we've got to be really strategic about this. And 9 times out of 10, we're just, am I still there?
There you are.
It's
still,
okay.
You're still there. Still there,
still
Billy.
here. Well, yeah. 9 times out of 10, the movement is knee-jerk. This is something that is a strategic issue for trade unions, and we need to lead with that. And I think what you said tonight, Howard, and obviously what fantastic way Caroline and Maria are doing, I think we are. I don't want to go into too much hyperbole, but we are really at a seminal point. And I think, you know, I think what you said tonight, Howard, was really encouraging to us who've been plugging away inside the trade union movement. And I say this as somebody, you know, who's been involved a lot in the trade unions over the years. We tend to be some of the most conservative small C institutions in British society. And I think we're at a seminal point. So great to hear you say what you said tonight, Howard.
Thanks so much for that, Billy. Our little special guest, not advertised, but here. And now we also, I think, John McDonnell has arrived. I can't see him, but I'm going on the assumption that John has arrived and that he's going to be talking in a minute. So again, John will not need any introduction from me at all. Member of Parliament for Hayes and Harlington, long-time supporter of proportional representation and very well known throughout the ranks of Momentum. So John, if you're here, the floor is yours, and if you could keep it to 10 minutes, that would be great.
It'll be less than that. I'm here, Maria. This sounds like a seance.
they are.
I'm here. I'm knocking. Okay. I'm sorry I've missed Howard. I was at another meeting. It sounds as though Howard's convinced everyone won the argument and there's not much for you to say. Look, I'll be extremely brief, almost a few sentences. The reason I come at this as from an absolutely fundamentally principled position, which is I want any electoral system that I can win in. Simple as that, basically. I just want power. I want to get into government. And there's been a couple of books written which I had no participation in terms of the recent period, but someone said I come out of it as absolutely power hungry, desperate to get into government, and will do whatever it takes. That's bloody true, really. That's exactly right. I want to create a socialist revolution. And part of that is mobilizing a mass social movement, which is a labour and trade union movement and wider elements in civil society. But alongside that, we have to recognize that actually getting into government is part and parcel of that. And I'm just fed up with losing, you know. I'm also a Liverpool supporter, so I'm a bit pissed off about that as well at the moment in terms of the number of home defeats we've had. But I'm fed up of losing, and what I can't cope with at the moment is Johnson winning an 80-seat majority on the basis of the votes that he got. Because if you look at the run of Tory results at least since 2010, they just should not be in government. And they certainly should not be in government with this majority of seats that they've got. And if we had a fair voting system, they wouldn't. So it is as simple as that. I want a government elected that genuinely does represent the views of ordinary working class people in this country. And I actually do think, if you look at the numbers, that the views of ordinary working class people are largely on the left. They're centre left, whatever you want, but certainly left of centre, because they vote largely for progressive parties. And what the Tories have been successfully able to do is maintain a first past the post system, which gerrymanders them into government. And we've got to recognise that. It's one element of the way things are rigged and stacked against us. So that's why I want to get into government, because I want to change the world. And the best way of doing that is after a voting system which actually gives us a chance of that. I know, I'm sure you've gone through all of this, you know, the last two times we've had large majorities was Blair and Attlee, and both of them were in extremely special circumstances. The Attlee government was after the 30s and the Second World War, when people wanted radical change, and they marched out to enable that to happen with the Labour government. Then with Blair, to be honest, John Smith, if he'd have been alive, would have had the same majority, maybe bigger. It was because they'd had enough of the Tories for such a long period of time, and particularly the sleaze and all the other elements that were associated with the Tories. But I don't want to have to wait for years and years and years until people get really brassed off with the Tories and they just want to change. I want to be in a situation where we've got a fighting chance of actually getting an administration that does reflect people's overall views. And just because you've got a PR system doesn't mean to say you can't, as a party, form a majority government. Look what's happened elsewhere, Scotland and elsewhere. But also, I also believe that if we go into a government on a proportional representation system, even if we haven't got an overall majority of seats, actually, I think we can win the argument with our other political partners that we'll need for their support. I think the policies that we'll advocate are popular, and therefore you call the bluff of the other parties. You either put us into government to implement these policies, or blow that, we'll go into an election. And let parties try and prevent a Labour government going into a Labour Party going into government with the range of popular policies that we had. I don't think they'd stand a chance. So that's why I think it would put us in an extremely powerful position and will enable us to the next generation, really, of Labour MPs on the left to create the transformative government that we desperately need. So that's what I'm all about. It's extremely principled. I just want to win. I want to win. And the reason I want to win is because it will give us the tools then that we can then construct the sort of society that we want. And it's interesting, I've been doing meetings around proportional representation for quite a while now, and we often sometimes get trapped into the weeds of what sort of system. My view is I just want a PR system where there is some constituency link, and it's perfectly not beyond the wit of any of us to design one that will be effective like that. And in that way, you both get a proper national representation of views, but also at the local level, you also get a real representation of views, but also a linkage between the local community and whoever they then elect to represent them. And that's, again, I just think it's perfectly logical now. So it's the stage that we've reached. I think you've already mentioned that in virtually every organisation we participate in as well, we don't use this archaic voting system of first past the post. In virtually most of our movements organisations, we do have forms of proportional representation in different ways. And then that way we elect people who are genuinely representative and genuinely capable of being delegated to implement the wishes of the memberships of whatever organisation that we're in. I just think the time has come for it. I really do. I'm sure you've discussed this already, but all the evidence demonstrates if you are a socialist, all the evidence demonstrates in country after country that actually proportional representation enables us to get into office and enables us then to start the transformation, introduction of the transformation policies that we desperately need. And I think that's what's calling out for. And I'll just give one example, really. I think actually climate change is the biggest challenge that we now face. You know, it's the existential threat. People, we're quite easily capable exposing that the Tories' policies that they're putting forward are simply rhetoric, it's greenwashing. It will not only will it not have any effect, but actually it will even contribute towards the threat that we now face. I think that's a key policy that would be able to go into government on a platform that unites all of the progressive forces in this country, but it would require a Labour government to implement those policies. And on that basis, I think we would be able to confront, as I say, the major crisis that we now face. In fact, it's our only hope, I think, of making sure that we can. And an issue after issue, I think we can prove the case for proportional representation that will enable us to get into government on a progressive programme and convince whatever electoral partners that we need to get into government that is the programme that they would endorse and support as well. So they're my arguments. I just think they're common sense, really. And I actually do think we're winning the argument on this one. If you look at all maybe on the polling that has been done amongst Labour Party members, there's quite overwhelming support now. The constituency numbers, what is it, over 200 now that have come in backing this now? That's over virtually a third of the rank and file movement. And you've now got a large number of trade unions now who are interested in looking at their new forms of electoral system. So I think it's an idea as time has come. That's why we do need to get it on the floor of conference this year. If we fail to do that, I think we miss a huge trick and it will be a setback for us. And that's why I really do urge people to prioritise this as the issue. It's no longer just a issue for a number of zealots like myself and others. I think it's a much wider, huge issue for the mass of the movement now, and I think they recognise that. I'm rambling on here, Marie, so you better shut me up. Okay.
Yeah, okay. You've invited me to shut you up. Let's just show John a little bit of love and appreciation, and also Caroline as well, who I didn't manage to. Oh, yeah. Nice. Thank you so much to John, to Caroline, and we've already thanked. Was I muted all that time? Sorry, Howard has got to go in a minute. So we've been collecting the questions and I'm just going to give Howard first go at the questions. And basically there's a few groups of questions. There's one on sort of trade unions in general, you know, are there any sort of typical historical reasons that unions give for not supporting PR? Then there's the questions that always come up about a progressive alliance. If you want to just, you know, maybe address yourself to one of those, Howard, before you go, and then we'll take the other speakers' answers.
Well, Billy touched on the reason in respect to trade unions that although, although trade unions should be at the forefront of transformative agendas, they are naturally conservative, and then our structures, with a small c, and then our structures are themselves very bureaucratic. So achieving change of policy in trade unions could naturally be very slow. There has also been a historic concern from the trade unions, which obviously I reference in my contribution, that that proportional representation allows the BNP its seats, allows the extremists into Parliament, and makes them potentially able to form some type of coalition. All arguments that I firmly believe are rejected, and the irony of the historical trade union position, it is the trade unions who drove out racists from their own communities. You know, with John's obviously from Liverpool, where the Transport and General Workers Union drove the BNP out of Liverpool. And it is the trade unions who've always taken that argument about the fact that we have to engage with our communities. And here we have an electoral system that is all about engaging with our communities. And that's why the trade union movement should waken up to the fact that proportional representation is essential going forward.
Okay, thank you so much. Caroline, John, who wants to go first, just addressing some of these questions that come up?
I'm happy with either.
Go. Okay, you start then, Caroline, and then we'll go over to John.
So which questions are we addressing, Maria? Are we going through the chat, or are we taking questions from the floor?
So you can take questions. I mean, the questions were all in the chat, and they have fallen into certain groups. So there are some about the trade unions, but there's a number of questions. There's a couple of questions about, is there a possibility that the Labour Party will split?
Let's hope.
I'll take that one, shall I?
Wipe that off the recording.
I will take that one. So we do get asked that quite a lot at CLPs. It's interesting. So we had Helen Clark, who launched the whole Labour for a New Democracy project. And one of the things that she said, she used to be pro first past the post and was really quite anti-PR because she was really concerned that New Zealand Labour would split. And actually there was a lot of talk about how it would split, and it hasn't. It's united the party because it's allowed them, you know, to kind of, it's given them the option that they could go their own way if they wanted to, and they decided that united was stronger. I mean, in terms of splitting the party, you know, who knows what would happen? But
why is the question, Caroline? Why would you split in order to then form a government by way of coalition?
You would be in a coalition.
Yeah.
And I mean, look at countries like Portugal, where you do have, you know, sort of a fractured left, and they end up in a coalition working together as though they were under one umbrella anyway. And ultimately, the policy we get in countries that use PR is better. So, you know, it's, for me, it's always about, you know, you need to bring it back to policy and what kind of policy we want. And that, you know, that's the start point. And if that means that, you know, Labour stays together and unifies under policy, then great, you know, and that's, you know, who would know what would happen? There's examples of both.
Yeah, and as I think you probably said, Howard, that, you know, the point is that if the Labour Party did split, as is threatening to happen, you know, it doesn't matter. Under PR, you know, we're safe either way. John, would you like to address yourself, I don't know, maybe to some of the questions about a progressive alliance, you know, to get rid of the Tories in 2024? Will it be necessary for Labour to talk to other parties thinking about PR? How do we do that? And several other questions sort of along the same vein.
My own concern about any negotiations before an election is that I don't think the electorate like sort of stitch-ups that for political parties. I think it is better for us to go in as independent parties, fight the relevant seats, etc., and then at the end, once we've got those results, then we sit down and see who goes into government, and whether we form some form of grouping that goes into government, or whether we do a deal around policies that a Labour government will advocate, even if we don't bring other electoral partners into government itself. And just so you know, I'll gossip, shall I? I've been in this situation when towards the end of Jeremy's administration. Remember, we were meeting with the opposition parties on a weekly basis. In fact, Ian Blackford, the SNP leader, was phoning me so often, my wife was worried we were having a relationship at one point. It was bizarre. And we were just having continuous conversations, and we offered we basically said to them, put Jeremy into number 10 with your support, and we will make sure that we deal with Brexit. We'll make sure that Brexit is dealt with, and then after that we'll go to the people, and the people can then decide in an election what sort of government that they want. And the interesting thing about all of that was it was the Lib Dems who actually prevented us implementing that strategy. It was, I think it was Chuka Umunna's influence on the Swinson, the Lib Dem leader at the time. But we were perfectly open to some form of arrangement with them that would put us into government, deal with a particular issue, and then go to the electorate itself. So these sort of discussions and conversations go on across parties all the time. And even on individual issues, on votes, on particular pieces of legislation, if you're trying to build a majority, it's nothing untoward. It's just the normal grist of politics on a daily basis at the parliamentary level. So I don't think there's anything that in any way hampers that sort of discussion in the future when you've got a PR system that throws up a wide range of political balance, if you like, within Parliament itself. But this issue about the split, you know, I actually don't think there'll be a split in those circumstances. But I don't think, and part of the reason we've got to work on that basis as well is because I actually think somehow what PR will help us do is make sure that our party is less controlled from above and centralized, and much more controlled and activated by the members on the ground. Because under a PR system, you are hunting for every vote in whatever area you're in. The membership has to be much more engaged and a much more of a social movement on the ground itself. And when you build that sort of membership and that sort of movement, they want a lot more control over what's going on, a lot more say over what's going on than just leaving it in the hands of a few parliamentarians. So I think that's one of the gains that you get from a PR system, which does make it more democratic internally within the parties themselves. And when you are in a democratic engagement like that, you're more likely to stay with the party than moving outside of it, because you feel you've got that much more of opportunity to shape and influence policies. So my view is that the PR system would most probably, I know people think this is contradictory, but I actually think it's more likely to hold us together than it is to divide us, because people will have much more of a say and a much bigger role from the rank and file element of the movement itself. But, you know, my view is that all of these discussions all rotate around one single thing, which I keep repeating, is to get us into power. And the reason we're going into power is to give power away. That's the whole point. We go into power as a government, and then we give power away to local communities and individuals, etc. So it's a sort of a mutually reinforcing cycle of politics that we want to get on.
Well, thank you, John. Now, I can just tell you that in the chat, Michael Kennedy has just said, could John write an essay on PR? So that's your next order tonight. That's a little bit of work for you.
It would be a B- grade.
Yeah, John would get somebody else to do it. Maria, I'm going to have to pop off. Can I just say that I also agree that it wouldn't lead to a split in Labour for the reasons that John said. But obviously, you know, what it would make Labour have to do is listen to communities and to the membership. So it would change policy rather than create a split, in my view. But I'm going to have to pop off to another event. But thank you very much for having me tonight.
Thank you,
Howard.
Cheers.
Thank you very much. Right, so I think we're supposed to finish at 8:30, but if we're very quick with our questions. Now I can see that Monica has put a couple of questions in the chat, and just to save time, I'm going to read out your first question, which is directed to John, and it says, John, why do you think so many MPs have been against PR, by which I think you mean Labour MPs, because it's obvious why Tory MPs are against PR. So why do you think so many Labour MPs, John, have been against PR?
Because when you're a member of Parliament and you've secured your seat, the last thing you want to do is in any way jeopardise it by experiments with a new system. And that's not an accusation of careerism by any means. It means they've secured their seat and they've gone there. I think most MPs go into Parliament because they want to do good. They want to do something with their lives. So having got there, the last thing they want is to mess about with the system that put them in there. That's the first thing. And the second thing as well is because a lot of them haven't really engaged with the argument so much. And that's why if we can get this on the floor conference this year, it will mean a greater level of engagement amongst every element of the party, amongst Labour MPs as well. So if we can do it this year, I think it really will open up the eyes of a large number of parliamentarians who maybe think this is a bit of a risk, but actually, from my perspective, will give them a much securer way forward and a much securer way of getting into government. And most of them, and again, this isn't for careerist reasons, for the vast majority of them, the reason they want to climb up part of that greasy pole is they want to get into positions where they can start implementing the policies that they advocate.
Thank you, John. Now, David Hayward has been waiting very, very patiently indeed. David, if you have a question that you can compress into 20 seconds, please. You've typed it in the chat, bless you. The question is this: for change to occur, we need to change all current regional officials who will block all grassroots attempts to engage. Okay, that's not really a question, but if anyone would, if John or Caroline would like to say anything about that.
Caroline, you can come in, but I don't want to get anyone into trouble, but my view on all of this is that we do need a really thorough debate about democracy in the party as well. And that includes at every level. And I've advocated this for a while, so this isn't an attack on any individual. I actually believe, well, you don't have to read Max Weber or Trotsky or whatever. I actually believe we've got to ensure we have methods to prevent our party being bureaucratized. And one of those methods is the election of officials rather than appointment. So I'd like to see regional officials elected under PR rather than just simply appointed. In that way, they're much more accountable.
Wow.
Yeah.
Go on, Caroline.
I was just going to say, it comes down to, PR is that's that start point, get that in place and everything else kind of follows behind it.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So we are now just about out of time. So basically, I just need to thank our speakers again. Howard's gone already. Caroline, John, thank you so much for speaking to us tonight, but also thank you all for coming. And just before we go, I would just like to give a reminder about the things that everybody can do to make this thing happen. Number one, if you're in Momentum, vote for the motion on PR in the Momentum ballot and put it at the top. Second of all, if you have friends or relatives who are in Momentum, get them to do the same. Or people in your local Momentum group, just, get it out there, get other people to do it. Work in your constituency Labour Party to persuade them. We are looking for motions to be submitted to the 2021 conference. So get that happening. We need lots of lots of constituencies to submit resolutions to conference. And finally, if you are in a trade union, even if you're just active in your local branch, and if you're sort of more important than that, then all the better, really get working in your trade union, because that is really where the fight is going now. And if you have any questions about doing that, either in the CLP or in your trade union, we in LCR or in Labour for a New Democracy are sort of here to give help and advice. So thank you once again all for coming. I think it's been great. I've really enjoyed myself. So thank you and good night.